The church at Withymead was cold, the way only stone can be cold in late October, and the bride at the altar wore a veil so heavy that the candlelight could not find her face. She stood very straight in a borrowed gown of dove gray, her gloved hands folded over a small prayer book, and she did not tremble. The man beside her had not once looked at her directly. He had spoken his vows to the air above her shoulder, his jaw set, his voice level and low. A man performing a transaction he had decided to despise. Behind them the pews held 40 witnesses, and not one had come for love. They had come to see what a desperate baron would marry for money, and to see the heiress no one had seen. The whisper had run ahead of her for a month now, carried from drawing room to drawing room like a coin passed between gloves. And the whisper said she was plain past mending, scarred by the pox, kept behind that veil because the sight of her would shame the family that had bought her. The baron took her hand to lead her from the altar, and felt, through 2 layers of kidskin, that her hand was perfectly steady. His own was not. He marked that, and disliked that he had marked it. At the church door, where the gray light came in and the wind moved the candles, the wedding party gathered to see the veil lifted. It was custom. The aunt had insisted upon it, smiling, certain. And the bride reached up with both hands, unhurried, and folded the heavy lace back from her face. The whisper died in 40 throats at once. What no one in that church yet understood was that the veil had hidden nothing the rumor had promised, and everything the rumor had been built to conceal. To understand how a woman came to stand at that altar veiled like a penitent, one must go back 6 weeks, to a narrow house in a market town where the rain had not stopped for 3 days, and a young woman sat at her late father's desk doing the only thing she knew how to do well. Winifred Serrell was 24 years old, and she was, by the measure of the season, nothing at all. She had no title, no beauty that announced itself across a room, no mother to push her forward, no brother to settle a portion on her. What she had was a father 6 months in the ground, a house mortgaged to the chimney pots, and a head for figures so exact that the men who had managed his affairs had begun quietly to be afraid of her. She was plain. She would have told you so herself without flinching, the way she stated the price of coal. Her face was long and grave, her brown hair drawn back without ornament, her mouth set in the habit of a woman who had learned young that no one was coming to admire her and that she had better make herself useful instead. Her eyes, though, were a clear, level gray, and when they fixed on a man who was lying to her, they did not waver, and more than one merchant had found that harder to bear than her plainness. Her father had left her a dowry. That was the strange, cruel joke of it. Edgar Terrell, a careful wool merchant all his life, had tied up nearly the whole of his remaining fortune in a marriage settlement for his only daughter before the fever took him. £3,000 in the 4%, untouchable by her, untouchable by his creditors, to be released only into the hands of the man who married her. He had meant it as protection. He had not lived to see it become a lure. For 3 weeks after the funeral, the house had been quiet. Then the letters began. The first came from a solicitor she did not know, a Mr. Bott. Sapworth of Chancery Lane, written in a hand so careful it looked engraved. It conveyed, with many soft words, the interest of a gentleman of rank in forming an alliance with the late Mr. Carroll's daughter. The gentleman, it said, was Cassian Wells, Baron Norhaven of Ederton Lodge in the county of Hampshire. The letter did not mention the £3,000. It did not need to. Winifred read it twice, and understood her own value to the world with a clarity that did not hurt as much as she had expected, because she had never been under any illusion about it. She had heard the name Norhaven only once, in the way one hears the names of the great houses, as a thing that happened to other people. The barony was old, and the money was gone. There had been a father who gambled, and a son who came home from the war to find the roof failing, and the tenants behind, and a name worth more than the land it stood on. That was enough to tell her what she was being asked to do, which was to save a stranger's house with her dead father's money and to be grateful for the chance. What no one had told her was that she would never be permitted to meet him before the wedding. That condition arrived in the second letter. And it did not come from the Baron at all. It came from his aunt. Almira, the Dowager Lady Sefcombe, was the sort of woman the season produced and then could not control. She had married a viscount, buried him, and devoted her long widowhood to the management of other people's lives, and her nephew's affairs she considered entirely her own. It was she who had found the Carroll girl, she who had calculated the £3,000 against the Etterton mortgage and found the sum exact. She who had arranged every particular of the match while Cassian was away at the coast, and she who, when he returned and balked, had worn him down across 4 evenings. The Dowager, however, had built her plan on a foundation that was a lie, and she had built it on purpose. She had told her nephew that the girl was disfigured. Scarred by the smallpox as a child, she said, plain past any saving, kept indoors by a father ashamed to show her. It was not true. Lady Sefcombe had never laid eyes on Winifred Carroll. She had invented the scar the way a card player invents a tell, because a baron, who believed his bride hideous, would expect nothing of the marriage but the money, would not look too closely, would not interfere, and would leave the whole administration of that money in the hands of the aunt who had arranged it all. A plain wife, the family pitied, was a wife the family could govern. A beautiful one might be admired, courted, listened to. Lady Sefcombe did not intend to be listened to. She intended to be obeyed. And so the veil. The girl would be married veiled, the Dowager wrote, out of modesty, out of mourning for her father, out of consideration for the delicacy of the occasion. The face would be revealed at the church door after the vows, when nothing could be undone. Winifred read that letter 4 times. She understood at the last reading that she had been described to her future husband as a monster, and that the description had been a deliberate one, though she could not yet see why. She sat for a long while with the rain on the window. Then she took out a fresh sheet, and instead of a reply she began, out of her father's long habit, to make a list. On one side she wrote what she had. On the other, she wrote what she could lose. The columns did not balance. And she was a woman who could not abide a column that did not balance, and so she made the only entry that would make it balance, and that entry was herself. She would marry the stranger. She would let them veil her, and she would go to Etterton Lodge, and find out, with her own gray eyes, and her own exact mind, precisely what had been arranged. In the dark around £3,000 of her father's love. The wedding was set for the last week of October, in the parish church at Withymead, 3 miles from the lodge, where the Norhaven family had been christened and married and buried for 200 years. Winifred arrived 2 days early with a single trunk, a single companion, and a calm that the household servants mistook for stupidity and the Dowager mistook for fear. The companion was a woman named Miss Droole, who had been Winifred's governess and was now her only friend in the world, a thin, sharp-eyed spinster of 50, with ink stains permanently on her right forefinger, and no patience at all for nonsense. It was she who unpacked the trunk, and she who on the first evening stood at the window of the cramped chamber they had been given at the back of the house, and said the thing they had both been thinking. "They have put us over the kitchens," she said, "a baron's bride, and they have put us where the smoke comes up." She turned from the glass. "Winifred, this is not a marriage they mean to honor. It is a purchase they mean to forget." "I know it," Winifred said. She was sitting on the edge of the narrow bed with her father's old account book open on her knee, the one she had carried from the narrow house, the one that held in his small, dead hand every shilling of the settlement, and the exact terms under which it was to be released. "Which is why I mean to read every line of what they have written before I sign my name to any of it." She did not sleep that night. She sat up with a single candle, and the account book and the copy of the settlement Mr. Grits. Sapworth had sent, and she read it the way she read everything, slowly, with her finger under the words. Somewhere near 2 in the morning, in a clause buried in the 4th paragraph of the 3rd page, written in language designed to be skimmed and not read, she found the first thing that was wrong. The settlement her father had drawn released the £3,000 to her husband, to be held for the benefit of the marriage, and any children of it with the income to provide for the wife, should she be widowed. That was plain. That was protection. The document Mr. Sapworth had sent did not say that. It said the principal was to be conveyed upon the marriage into a trust, and the trustee named in that trust was not the Baron at all. The trustee was Elmira, the Dowager Lady Sefcombe. Winifred sat very still. The candle guttered and steadied. She read the clause a fifth time, and a sixth, and there was no mistaking it. Her father's £3,000 meant to bind her to a husband and shelter her old age, had been quietly diverted in the drafting to make a widowed aunt the mistress of every penny of it. The Baron would marry her. The Baron would get the credit for saving his house, and the money would pass through his hands without stopping and come to rest in the grip of a woman Winifred had never met, who had described her as a monster to keep her quiet and powerless in the bargain. What Winifred did not yet know, sitting over that candle, was that the Baron had not read the clause either. She also did not know, because the prose of the settlement could not tell her, that Mr. Sapworth had not written it gladly. The solicitor was an honest man fallen into a dishonest debt, and Lady Sefcombe held the note of it, and the difference between an honest man and a dishonest one is sometimes only the size of the sum someone holds over his head. He had drawn the clause she dictated, and he had hated his own hand. As it moved, Winifred could not read any of that in the document. She could read only the clause itself, sitting in the page like a spider in a clean web, and the knowledge that she was being robbed in the very act of being rescued. She closed the book. She blew out the candle. And in the dark she made a second list, this one only in her head, and at the top of it she wrote the name she had not yet seen. The next morning she met her husband at last, and it was not the meeting either of them had been promised. It happened by accident in the long gallery where Winifred had gone before breakfast to be alone, and had instead found a man standing at the far window with his back to her, looking out at the failing park. She knew him at once, though she had never seen his face. There was no one else he could be. He was tall and built broad through the shoulder, dressed plainly, in a dark coat that had been good once and been kept too long, his black hair cut close. The morning light came hard across the side of his face, a grave face, strong-boned, the jaw held tight, a thin pale scar running through the outer end of his left eyebrow, where some old injury had healed badly. He heard her step and turned, and for one moment before either of them could remember what they had been told to expect, they simply looked at each other. His eyes were a dark, smoke gray, and they moved across her face with a swift confusion. She watched him try to master. He had been told she was disfigured. He was looking at a plain woman in a gray gown, grave and unornamented, with steady gray eyes that did not drop from his, and there was no scar, no ruin, nothing of the monster he had been promised. She saw the calculation cross his features and saw him fail to hide it, and she understood, in that instant, something the Dowager had never meant her to understand, which was that he did not know. He had been lied to in his own house. "You are at the wrong end of the gallery for a guest," he said. His voice was low and level, careful, giving nothing. "The breakfast room is the other way." "I am not a guest," Winifred said. He went still. The gray eyes came back to her face and stayed there. "No," he said after a moment. "I begin to think you are not." He did not bow. He did not smile. Something in the set of his shoulders changed, though. Some weight redistributed, like a man who has been bracing against a blow that did not land. "My aunt described you otherwise." "I am aware of how your aunt has described me," Winifred said. "She has described me to half of London. I have come 3 days early, and over the kitchens, my lord, so I imagine she described me to you as something you would not wish to look at closely." For a long moment he said nothing. The park lay gray beyond the glass, the bare trees black against a white sky. Then the Baron of Norhaven did a thing his aunt would have forbidden absolutely. He crossed the length of the gallery, stopped at a proper distance, and looked at her as if she were a person, and not a sum. "Then we have both been managed," he said. That was the whole of their first conversation. It lasted 4 minutes. Winifred carried it down to breakfast like a coal in her hand, and she understood that the man she was to marry was not her enemy. He was only, like her, a piece on a board that someone else believed she owned. The 2 days before the wedding passed in a careful, watched quiet, and through all of it the dowager moved like a general before a battle she was certain of winning. Lady Sefcombe was charm itself to the bride's face, and steel behind it. She arrived the day before the ceremony in a carriage, with her arms still on the door, and she swept through Etterton Lodge as if it were already hers, ordering the flowers moved and the chairs rearranged and the heavy veil brought down from the box she had sent ahead. She was a tall woman, still handsome, dressed in the deep colors of a wealthy widow, with diamonds at her ears that had not been paid for in 3 years. And she looked at Winifred exactly once, a long downward look that took in the gray gown and the plain face and the steady eyes. And what crossed her own face was the first flicker of doubt she had felt in 6 weeks. She had not expected the steadiness. She covered it at once. "You will wear the veil from the house," she said, smiling, her voice pitched to carry to the servants. "It is the custom in this family, and it does honor to your dear father's memory that you should come to the altar in your mourning, with your face composed in private prayer. It will be lifted at the door when you are a wife." She let the smile widen. "We must give the parish something to see." "You are very kind to think of my father," Winifred said, so evenly that the dowager could find no edge in it to catch on, and was, for that reason, more unsettled than if the girl had wept. That was the first of the 3 times Winifred would hear herself named for what the dowager wished her to be. The dowager said it quietly, as an aside, leaning close as a maid passed, with an armful of white roses. "She is a plain, biddable little thing," Lady Sefcombe murmured, watching her nephew across the room. "Grateful, I should think, and dull. She will give us no trouble." The maid heard it. Miss Drewell heard it. Winifred, who was meant to hear it, gave no sign that she had, and filed it away with the clause in the settlement in the same cold, orderly place where she kept the things she meant to answer. That night, the last night, Cassian came to find her. He did it improperly, which told her how much it cost him. He sent no message and waited for no chaperone. He simply appeared at the door of the back parlor, where she sat with Miss Drewell and the account book, a branch of candles in his hand, and the scar pale through his eyebrow, and he said, "Miss Carroll, a word, if your companion will permit it." Miss Drewell, who missed nothing, took up her sewing and removed herself to the far end of the room, near enough for propriety and far enough for privacy, and bent over her needle as though the fate of England depended on her hem. He set the candles down. He did not sit. "I have come to say a thing I should have said in the gallery," he began, and stopped, and Winifred watched him search for the words the way a man searches for footing on a wet bank. "I agreed to this marriage believing you were a creature to be pitied and hidden. I agreed to it for the money. I will not insult you by pretending otherwise, because you are plainly too clever for it, and I am too tired to lie well." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite toward a smile. "But I have watched you these 2 days. You do not flinch. You do not flatter. You sat at my aunt's table tonight and answered every barb she set for you with a courtesy so exact that she could not tell whether you were a fool or the cleverest woman in the county, and neither could I. And I find that I want very much to know which." Winifred closed the account book over her finger. "And if I am the second, then I have done you a great wrong by buying you," he said, "and I do not yet know how to undo it." It was not a declaration. It was something better because it was true, and because it cost him to say it, and because he said it in the plain, level voice of a man who had stopped performing. Winifred felt the held breath go out of her slowly. She had braced for cruelty or for indifference, and she had no defenses prepared for a man who came in the night to tell her he was sorry. "My lord," she said, "before you decide how to undo it, there is a thing you should read." And she opened the account book, and beside it the copy of the settlement. And she put her finger under the 4th paragraph of the 3rd page, and she watched his face as he read it. She watched the gray eyes move along the line. She watched them reach the name. She watched them stop. For a moment, he did not move at all. Then he took the candle nearer and read the clause again, and when he straightened, the careful, governed quiet had gone out of him, and something harder had come into its place, banked low like a fire under ash. "This is not the settlement her solicitor described to me," he said. "No, she is to hold the whole of it." He set the page down with great care, as if it might break, or as if he might. "My house is to be saved with your father's money, and your father's money is to belong to my aunt, and you and I are to be the two people in England with the least say in any of it." A muscle moved in his jaw. "She has not robbed you. She has robbed us both, and married us to do it, and meant us never to compare our pages." "That was my reading as well," said Winifred. He looked at her then, and there was a new thing in the look, a kind of grim respect, the recognition of one careful person by another. "How long have you known?" "Since 2 o'clock this morning." "And you said nothing. You let her arrange her flowers, and her veil, and her triumph, and you said nothing." "I had not yet decided," Winifred said, "whether you were her partner or her victim. I know now. One does not show one's hand, my lord, to a man one has not yet weighed." She closed the book. "I will marry you tomorrow. I will let her veil me, and lift the veil, and have her moment at the door. And then, when she believes she has won, we will see what a plain, biddable little thing can do with a column of figures." For the first time since she had met him, Cassian Wells smiled. It was a brief thing, gone almost before it arrived, but it changed his whole grave face. And Miss Droole, bent over her hem, heard it in the silence, and smiled too, into her sewing. So it was that on the last morning of October, Winifred Terrell was married, veiled in the church at Withermede, to a man who knew now exactly what she was, and the only two people in the church who understood the joke were standing at the altar holding hands. The vows were spoken. The register was signed. Winifred's hand small and exact beneath the Baron's. And at the door in the grey light, with the dowager standing foremost among the witnesses, her chin lifted and her diamonds catching the cold sun, the bride reached up and folded back the veil. There was the silence first. 40 people had come to see a monster, and were looking instead at a plain, grave, unremarkable woman with steady grey eyes, and the disappointment moved through them like a draught, because a monster would have been a story, and a plain wife was only a transaction after all. The dowager's face for one instant showed the same disappointment, and then a swift recovery, because plain was what she had wanted. Plain was governable. She had lied about the scar not to frighten her nephew off, but to keep the bride small. And here was the bride. Small, as promised. Winifred did not behave as a small woman behaves. She did not drop her eyes. She looked once directly at Lady Sefcombe, a long, level, perfectly composed look, and then she put her gloved hand through the Baron's offered arm and walked out into the churchyard, as if the whole of Withermede belonged to her. And the dowager, watching her go, felt for the second time the cold finger of a doubt she could not name. The trouble began, as the dowager intended it to begin, the very next week when the settlement was to be executed and the money conveyed. Mr. Sapworth came down from London with the papers in a leather case, a small grey man with a guilty stoop, and he laid them out on the long table in the library, and Lady Sefcombe took her place at the head of it, as though the chair were a throne. The Baron sat at one side. Winifred sat at the other, in a gown of soft green, now her father's account book on the table before her, where everyone could see it, and no one thought to fear it. Miss Droole sat behind her. The autumn light came thin and gold through the tall windows onto the rows of book spines, and it should have been the dowager's hour of victory. "It is all in order," said Mr. Dree. Sapworth, not meeting anyone's eye. "The principal conveys into the trust. The trustee administers the income. The Baron's debts are discharged from the first quarter's release. We need only the signatures." He slid the deed toward the Baron. "My lord, if you would." Cassian did not take up the pen. He looked across the table at his wife. "My husband does not sign documents he has not read aloud," Winifred said pleasantly into the small silence. "It is a habit of mine that I have given him, Mr. Sapworth. Would you be so good as to read the clause naming the trustee? The fourth paragraph, the third page?" The solicitor's gray face went grayer. He looked at the Dowager. The Dowager's smile did not move, but her eyes did, flicking once to the account book on the table which she seemed only now to see. "Read it, Mr. Sapworth," said Lady Sefcombe, in a voice gone suddenly thin. "And let us be done." He read it. He read out, in his unwilling engraved voice, that the whole of the principal, £3,000 and the 4%, was conveyed into a trust whose sole trustee, with full power over the principal and the income both, was Almira, the Dowager Lady Sefcombe. He read it, and he set the page down, and he sat with his guilty stoop and waited for the room to fall on him. "I see," said Winifred. She opened the account book. The pages were covered in her father's close, careful writing, and in her own, and between them on the page she had marked lay every figure of the original settlement as Edgar Carroll had drawn it, copied out in the months before his death, witnessed, and dated by the two clerks who had served him 30 years. Then perhaps Mr. Bree. "Sapworth will explain to my husband why the settlement my father executed, which I hold here, witnessed, and dated the 3rd of March, names the trustee as the husband, and provides the income to the wife, and makes no mention whatsoever of Lady Sefcombe. The document on this table is not my father's settlement. It is a forgery of it, drawn since his death, and it has changed exactly one thing, which is, whose hand the money falls into." The silence in the library was absolute. This was the Dowager's defense, and she did not crumble at the first blow because she had not built her plan to crumble. She had a second line ready, and she fell back upon it without a flicker, leaning forward with the easy confidence of a woman who has held the whip hand all her life. "What a clever little forgery you have brought us, my dear," she said, and her voice was iron again. An account book in a dead man's hand, which any clerk might have copied, witnessed by two men in your father's pay, who will say whatever you put in their mouths. Set it beside Mr. Andiger. Sapworth's deed, drawn by an officer of the court, and ask yourself which a magistrate will believe, the grieving heiress with her homemade ledger, or the law. She smiled. "You are clever, child. But you are clever the way a counting house is clever. You do not understand how the world is held." It was a true blow, and it landed because it was the Dowager's whole philosophy made into a sentence that the world belongs to those who hold its instruments, and not to those who are merely right. And it was the third time Winifred heard herself named now to her face before witnesses as a clever little nobody who did not understand the world. And this time the naming was not an aside or a custom, but a challenge thrown across a table. Winifred answered it the way she answered everything. She turned a page. "You are correct, my lady. The two ledgers may contradict, and a magistrate must choose," she said. "So I will not ask him to choose between them. I will ask him to read a third document, which neither of us has yet mentioned, and which decides the matter entirely." She did not raise her voice. "Mr. Sapworth's deed conveys the principal into the trust. But the principal is not the Baron's to convey, and it is not mine. It sits, and has sat since the 3rd of March in the 4% at the bank registered in trust under my father's executors, who are the two clerks who witnessed his book. No deed signed in this library can move a shilling of it. Only the executors can release it, and they release it only upon proof of the settlement my father drew, the true one which they hold the third original of, sealed, in London." She closed the account book gently. "Your forgery, my lady, is very good. It is also worthless, because it gives you authority over money that the law has already placed beyond your reach in the hands of two men in my father's pay, as you so rightly observed. My father did not trust the world to be just. He trusted his clerks, and he tied the knot where no widow's deed could reach it. I came here 3 days early not to read your settlement, which I had already seen through. I came to learn whether my husband would help me cut the knot or help you tie it tighter. He has chosen. And there is nothing on this table that you can sign to change it. For a moment, the dowager did not move. The thin gold light lay across her diamonds and her handsome ruined face, and the doubt that had flickered twice now opened all the way. And she understood at last what had been sitting across the table from her in a gray gown for a week, composed and courteous and underestimated, reading every barb and answering none, waiting. She had described the girl as plain to keep her small. The girl had let her believe the plainness was the whole of her, and had used the weak the lie bought to find the one fact the scheme rested on, and pull it out from underneath. Lady Sefcombe rose. It was the only thing left that she could control, the manner of her leaving, and she gathered it around her, like a mantle. "You think you have won something," she said, and her voice had lost its iron and gone brittle, fragmenting at the edges. "You have won a failing house and a man who married you for money. You have won a barony that cannot keep its own roof. I wish you joy of it." But her hand, reaching for her gloves, was not steady, and everyone in the room saw that it was not. Then Cassian spoke, and it was the only time in the whole affair that he raised his voice above its level register, and even then he did not shout. He stood, and he came around the table, and he stopped beside his wife's chair, and he set his hand upon her shoulder, claiming her before the solicitor and the companion and the aunt who had sold him a monster and been answered with a wife. "My wife stays." He said 3 words, level, final. "You go." The dowager looked at the hand on Winifred's shoulder. She looked at her nephew's face and found nothing in it she could use. And she gathered her gloves and her brittle dignity and went, and the door of the library closed behind her, and the trust her forgery had built fell down without a sound, because it had been built on money she had never been able to touch. Mr. Sapworth was still sitting with his guilty stoop. He did not run. That was the first thing in his favor. He sat with his grave face in his hands for a moment, then lifted it, and he said to the Baron and not to Winifred, because it was the Baron he had wronged most directly. "She held a note of mine, my lord. £1,100. From a bad year she said she would call it the day I refused her. I drew the clause she dictated, and I have hated my own hand every day since, and I will give evidence of every word of it to any court you please." He set the forged deed in the middle of the table, face up, where it could not be mistaken. "That is the false one. Burn it. The true settlement waits in London, under your father-in-law's seal, exactly as your wife has said. I always knew the true one would hold." Winifred looked at the small, gray, frightened, honest man for a long moment. She thought of her father, who had trusted his clerks and not the world, and who had been right. "Mr. Diz." "Sapworth," she said. "A man who draws a forgery, and then keeps the original safe so that it may undo him, is not a dishonest man. He is an honest man in a trap. My father would have said so." She drew the false deed toward her, folded it once, and held it to the candle, and they watched it burn down to a black curl on the cold hearth. "Pay your £1,100 out of the first release. Then go home, and do not draw another line for anyone you are afraid of." The man wept, a little in the way of a person who has expected ruin and been handed mercy instead, and then he gathered his case and went out into the autumn afternoon, a poorer and a freer man. The story of what had happened in the library did not stay in the library. These things never do. By the time the family went up to town for the small remainder of the season, the whole of it had run ahead of them. The coin passed between gloves again, but the story it told now was a different one. The plain heiress the Baron had bought for her money had turned out to read settlements better than the solicitors who drew them, and the dowager who had managed everyone had managed in the end only to expose herself. It was at a card party in town 3 weeks after the wedding that the last of it was settled, and the rival had her turn. Her name was Miss Henrietta Belgrave, and she had expected until the spring to be the next Baroness Norhaven herself. She was handsome and well-dowered and accustomed to winning, and she had not forgiven the Carroll girl for taking, with 3,000 merchants' pounds, the title she had thought as good as promised. She found Winifred near the windows, and she struck where she believed the plain wife would be softest. "You must find all this very grand, Lady Norhaven," she said, with a bright cruelty, loud enough for the nearest tables. After a counting-house, one does wonder what you find to say to a baron, when the figures are all added up. Winifred set down her cards. She was aware of the room half turning to listen, of Cassian across it with his back to a pillar, watching, not moving, leaving her the field. She looked at Miss Pelgrave with her clear gray eyes, and she did not flush. "I find a great deal to say to him," she answered evenly, kindly, in a voice that carried no further than it had to. "And he, I am glad to tell you, finds a great deal to say to me." It is the chief advantage of marrying for something other than a face, Miss Pelgrave. The face is the first thing one stops seeing, and the conversation is the thing one is left with. Whoever told you otherwise was selling you the wrong goods. It was not cruel. It was only true delivered so quietly and so completely that Miss Pelgrave, who had come prepared to wound a meek little nobody, found herself instead the one person in the room who had been measured and found wanting, and she retired from the window with her color high and did not try Winifred again. And it was then, across the murmuring room, that Cassian crossed to his wife. He came without hurry in his dark coat, the scar pale through his brow, and the room watched him come because rank draws the eye, even when it walks slowly. He stopped before her. He did not take her hand at once. He let the silence gather, and the card tables fell quiet around them. And into that quiet, in his low, level voice, before the whole of the season that had pitied her, he said the thing he had not said in the gallery, or the parlor, or the library, the thing he had been saving for the arena where the verdict had first been passed. "My wife is the wisest person I know," he said at once. He said her place and his choice, and the whole reversal of the season's judgment, in 7 plain words, and then he offered her his arm, and Winifred rose and took it, and they left the card party together while the room was still finding its breath. That was the marked first use, though no one in the room but Winifred caught it, for he had bent his head as he said it, and used, beneath the public words, the private one. He had called her Winifred. Not Lady Norhaven, not Miss Carroll, but her own given name, low and only for her, the first time he had ever said it aloud, and she heard it under the 7 words like a second sentence spoken only to her, and she understood that the public declaration and the private one had been made in the same breath, and that both were true. They did not stay in town. Neither of them cared for it, and the house at Edgerton needed them more than the season did. They went back into Hampshire in the first week of November, when the light came short and gold across the bare park, and began, together, the long, unglamorous work of mending a thing that had been let fall for 20 years. It suited them both. Winifred had the head for it, and Cassian had the land in his blood. And between them, with the first release of her father's money now safely in their own hands, they paid the worst of the debts and put a new roof on the east wing before the snow, and brought back 2 of the tenant families who had given up and gone. She kept the books, he walked the fields. In the evenings they sat in the library, where the forged deed had burned, the fire lit now, and she taught him the figures, and he taught her the names of the tenants, and Miss Drool sat in the corner with her endless hem and missed nothing. The dowager did not return. She wrote once a stiff letter of reconciliation that fooled no one, and Cassian answered it with a quarterly allowance settled on her out of the estate, enough to keep her comfortable and far away, which was more than she had earned and exactly as much as mercy required. She was not destroyed. She was only corrected and pensioned and made small in the one currency she had ever respected, which was the world's attention, for the world had stopped attending to her and started attending instead to the plain baroness who had outread her solicitors. That was punishment enough for a woman like her, and her nephew, who understood her better than she knew, had measured it out to the penny. On a still evening in the deep of winter, with snow falling slow and steady past the tall windows and the fire banked warm, Winifred sat with her father's old ledger open to its last page, the one in his own small dead hand, the one that had hung the whole scheme on a single true fact and held. She ran her finger down the final column, the one that had not balanced 6 weeks ago in a narrow house in the rain, until she had made it balance by entering herself. It balanced now. It balanced honestly, with her own name on the right side of it, Baroness of a house she had helped to save, wife to a man who had married her for money and stayed for the rest. Cassian came and stood behind her chair and looked down at the column with her, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder where it had rested in the library on the day he claimed her. "Your father was a careful man," he said. "He did not trust the world to be just," said Winifred, looking at the small dead hand on the page. "He trusted the people he had weighed, and the knots he had tied where no one could reach them. He was right about both." "He was right about one more thing," Cassian said low, and she felt rather than saw him smile. "He weighed me, in a way. He tied the money where only an honest man could free it, and made certain that whoever married you would have to deserve you before he could touch a penny of what was yours." His hand tightened briefly on her shoulder. "I did not deserve you when I married you, Winifred. I have been trying to since." Outside, the snow came down over the mended roof and the returned tenants, and the dark recovering fields, and inside the fire held warm against the tall cold windows. And Winifred Wells, who had been told she was plain past mending and biddable and dull, who had been veiled to be kept small and had folded the veil back to be seen, closed her father's ledger on its balanced page and laid her hand over her husband's, and let herself, for the first time in a year of grief and arithmetic, simply be still. If Winifred's journey moved you, I hope you will carry one small piece of it away with you tonight. The quiet certainty that worth has a way of being seen at last, even when the world has decided not to look. Stay warm, and thank you for staying to the end.